Hello, and welcome to Show Me History. I'm your host, Amy Blankenship. This is the last of a three-part episode featuring 1849, the year from hell. And I'd like to apologize to our listeners for the hiatus between episode 2 and 3. We've had COVID in our house, allergies, school stuff, and hopefully from here on we'll be back on track and get a new episode out every couple weeks. But today, I'll cover a few of the last topics from some rather interesting things that occurred in St. Louis in 1849, a bank robbery, a race riot, and a slave stampede. First, we'll begin with the bank robbery, the Great Nisbet Robbery. As the population of St. Louis increased, so did the crime rate. From petty theft to murders, the daily newspapers ran the gamut of crime reports. The city was ill-equipped to deal with the situation as it had no real police force. At the time, police department consisted of a day and a night patrol. These men were appointed by the council. In 1849, the city had 30 lieutenants and 30 patrolmen to watch over a city of 78,000 residents. The robbery began on March 24, 1849. During the night, 4 men robbed William Nisbet and Company. Nisbet was housed in the Perpetual Insurance Building that was located at the corner of Olive and Main, near the heart of the city. The building also contained the city's Chamber of Commerce. William Nisbet and Company was a private banking institution that contained safety deposit boxes full of silver, gold, and paper notes. They were located in a large walk-in safe in the basement. The building adjacent to Nisbet had recently been torn down, leaving one side of the Perpetual Insurance Company completely vulnerable. Plans for the robbery began days before execution. George Burnett, William Thompson, John Moran, and Thaddeus Clark approached a riverboat pilot by the name of Francis Cooley. The men promised Cooley a share of the loot if he would serve as lookout, so Cooley agreed. Setting to work at 10 p.m., the men arrived at the building. Their first task was to remove an iron door to access the building. That was easily accomplished. Once inside, Cooley took post in the hallway as lookout, and the other men got to work cracking the bank's vault. The first attempt was to access the bank's vault from above. They worked to reach the outer ceiling of the vault by smashing through 20 inches of brick. They made decent progress, only to find their passage was blocked by a large beam supporting the floor. So they devised a new plan. They broke down the wooden door between the insurance company's office and Nisbet and took a try at the outer door of the vault. Reaching the vault, they tried to pry the doors off, but had no luck. It was too risky to use gunpowder to blow up the lock, so they chiseled away at 18 inches of brick to make a hole big enough for a person to fit through. Once inside, they reached a series of chambers inside the vault. While I was reading these accounts, I kept thinking of the pyramids in Egypt, how there's multiple layers of rooms and halls before you get to the sarcophagus. So now that they've reached one area of the vault, they had a lot of work to do. They had to get through 3 feet of thick walls to the actual vault itself. After hours of chipping away more brick, they finally reached the walk-in vault, but not the money. They still had to go through the sheet iron walls of the safe. They were able to make about a 3-foot wide hole. One of the men crawled inside and passed the loot to the others. In all, the men took about $30,000 in banknotes, gold, and silver. So that's about $4 million in today's money. The men left the scene a hot mess. There was debris and brick everywhere. So afterwards, they went to a nearby hotel on Franklin Avenue to divvy up the goods. Cooley, the lookout man, received $3,000. So that's about $80,000 today. And afterwards, everyone went their separate ways. By the time the bank opened in the morning, nearly 1,000 nosy spectators had gathered outside the building. The city marshal and police captain deduced that the criminals must have worked for hours to accomplish the robbery. The citizens of St. Louis were outraged. Why hadn't the night watch noticed any activity? A local paper, the Missouri Republican, commented, quote, "How was the robbery committed in a populous business part of the city in full glare of the lamps, and could not have been effected short of 5 or 6 hours of labor, yet escaped noticed and was not detected by the vigilant guardian of the night on that beat?" End quote. Nisbet offered a $1,500 reward for the capture of the robbers, but little information arose. 2 weeks after the incident, Police Captain Cousins received news of a suspicious man arriving in Berlin, Illinois. It's a small town outside Springfield. 2 men had come into town with saddlebags full of money. They flaunted their money and bought an expensive wagon. Citizens of Berlin were aware of the Nisbet robbery and thought these 2 men could be part of it. Captain Cousins and David Foster, a bank clerk from Nisbet, boarded a steamboat and headed for central Illinois. On the boat, they met Mr. Spotward. Mr. Spotward was the owner of a safety deposit box in Nisbet and recently returned from California with a large sum of gold. So he joined Cousins and Foster's on their pursuit of the criminals. Once the men reached Berlin, Illinois, they learned that the 2 potential bank robbers had left town and were headed east. On what seemed like a wild goose chase, the St. Louis men followed the criminals all over to Indiana and Illinois and back. Finally, at Hudsonville, Illinois, the 2 criminals were spotted on the landing. Cousins was quick to seize both men and walk them up the plank to a steamboat. He led them to the ladies' quarters for interrogation. Those that were captured were George Burnett and William Thompson. With the help of a buggy driver, Cousins secured the men and brought them to Terre Haute, Indiana. There they secured passages on a stagecoach to St. Louis. At nightfall, the stagecoach stopped in Effingham, Illinois. Foster and Spotward went to a nearby station to rest. Cousins stayed in the stagecoach with the prisoners. Cousins soon fell asleep, and Bernard and Thompson escaped and disappeared into the forest. Meanwhile, Cooley, our lookout man, had reached Cincinnati. Suspicions arose about his involvement in the Nisbet robbery when a barrel containing $7,000 of cash was found in his home. He was arrested and placed in the Cincinnati jail. St. Louis police officer McCow boarded a steamboat to Cincinnati and brought Cooley back to St. Louis. On the way home, McCow began to interrogate Cooley. McCow promised Cooley that if he told all the details, Cooley would get a lighter sentence. So, Cooley spilled the entire can of beans. Cooley was tried and sentenced to 15 years in jail and prison despite no previous record and McCow's promise. Cooley and his lawyers appealed the sentence. The case made its way to Missouri Supreme Court. Cooley's sentence was reduced to 8 years in the state penitentiary. There, Cooley was joined by 2 of his cohorts. Barnett and Thompson had been captured by a local posse in Indiana and brought back to St. Louis for trial. They were indicted before a grand jury for burglary and grand larceny. Each were sentenced to 10 years. In 1853, Barnett and Thompson escaped. 2 years later, the governor pardoned Cooley. The remaining robbers and cash were never found. Crimes like this led to resentment of the police. Residents felt that the police force had no control or authority. They were disappointed in the police patrol. These men worked from 10 at night until the wee hours in the morning, and no one noticed anything. They were smashing through 2-3 feet of brick, and no one heard anything. It would not be until 1861 that the police department would be reorganized and structured to better accommodate the needs of the city. So now we will move on to our second story of the day, the race riots. So in July of 1849, a fire broke out in the city. It was nothing compared to the one that occurred earlier in the year, but a fire nonetheless. In this particular fire, 5 steamboats were lost and led to a riot between the fire captain and a group of Irish citizens. At this point in the year, the city is recovering from a massive fire in the midst of a cholera epidemic. Commerce is at a standstill, and hundreds of Irish deckhands were laid off. Steamboats were lined up for quarantine inspection and not able to reach the levee to unload cargo. There was no work to be done. There were 2 gangs of Irish in the city, the North Irish and the South Irish. In mid-July, a fight broke out between the 2 gangs on the levee. One gang took over the steamer Governor Briggs and forced out the crew. Later aboard the steamboat Iowa, a person was beaten and stabbed to death. Police managed to break up that incident, but more encounters between the 2 groups occurred over the next several days. So there's already some tension and unrest going on here. So on July 29th at 3 a.m., fire broke out in the engine room of the Algona and quickly spread to 4 other boats. Firemen responded to the alarm and were able to contain the fire. However, during the fire, The firemen asked some Irish boatmen to help in working the hand pump engine. The firemen were told no. Probably no in some other choice words if I had to guess. Around 8 a.m. the fire was contained and put out, and some members of the fire company patroned a nearby pub. For reasons unknown, an Irishman slammed a fireman against the wall and hit him in the back of the head with a heavy piece of iron. The man was arrested by the police. Other gang members arrived and threatened to destroy the fire company's engine. The engine and crew were bombarded with stones. The fire company retreated. They attempted to return the engine back to the firehouse, only to be surrounded by a group of Irishmen shooting at them. The firemen, also armed, began shooting back, creating a gun battle running through the Irish neighborhoods, destroying properties and buildings in their wake. The police managed to stop the incident and arrest several gang members and firemen. Later, crowds of angry Irish citizens gathered outside the city fire stations. The firemen, believing they were outnumbered, organized a raid on a moored steamboat, the Missouri, and stole a howitzer cannon. From the levee, the firemen proceeded to aim the cannon at Battle Row, and this is a neighborhood that was mainly Irish deckhands. Loaded with slugs, they fired the cannon continuously. The local militia unit was mobilized along with the volunteer citizens and attempted to restore peace. The violent scene lasted well into the night. Police were finally able to seize the cannon. A total of 27 rioters on both sides were arrested. Despite numerous injuries and unknown amounts of property damage, no sentences were given. That escalated pretty quickly, huh? What a scene that must have been to have a gunfight running through the streets of the city with firemen shooting a cannon at people and houses and businesses. So that is our story of the race riot of 1849. So now on to our last kind of strange event of 1849, the slave stampede. First, let's discuss that phrase, slave stampede. It's not all what it sounds. The term began appearing in the late 1840s and quickly spread. It's used to describe a group of 3 or more slaves attempting to escape. It can refer to masses of people of greater numbers, but typically it's a small group of people endeavoring for their freedom. And let's just say it's a horrible phrase, and I'm only using it because it's the terminology of the times. But before we get to the actual story, I'm going to cover a little bit of background, so some components of the events might make a little bit more sense to us. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 required the return of an escaped enslaved person. If attempted to force authorities in free states to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Some northern states completely ignored this act and allowed escaped slaves to become free citizens. They passed personal liberty laws that permitted such actions. In 1842, the Supreme Court case of Briggs v. Pennsylvania ruled that states did not have to offer assistance in searching or capturing enslaved people, but it really depended on the local rules and laws. Where someone was escaping to and from really made a difference in their outcome. At the time, Missouri was a slave state and Illinois was technically a free state. So, on to our story in St. Louis. This is about Henry, Jeff, Pell, and Tim. I'm going to read you an advertisement posted by the slave owners in the Missouri Republican. It gives a description of each man. Quote, $7,000 reward. Run away from subscribers on Saturday evening last. 4 Negro men as follows. A mulatto man belonging to John S. McCoon named Henry, about 20 years of age, medium-sized, hump-shouldered, is quick-spoken and quite polite in his manners, has been raised as a house servant. When he left, he had on a white vest and pantaloons and a new blue blanket coat. A dark mulatto man belonging to A. H. Glaspie, named Pell, about 20 years old, is badly marked with smallpox, medium size. He had with him 2 suits of dark clothes. A black Negro man belonging to Emmanuel Black, named Tim, about 24 years old. Thin lips, quite stoutly built, but not tall. Has been a fireman on a steamboat. It is not known what dress he had on when he left. A Negro man belonging to Williamson Pittman of Palmyra named Jeff, about 30 years of age. When walking, he limps very badly, one leg being several inches shorter than the other, a little under medium size, clothing not known. For the first 3, a reward of $50 will be paid for each, if taken within the state, or $200 if taken outside the state and delivered to us in St. Louis. For the last named reward of $25 will be paid if taken in the state, or $100 if taken without the state and delivered in a like manner." End quote. On October 27th, Henry, Jeff, Pell, and Tim escaped from St. Louis. They met their guide, a free black man named Bill Williams, at Bristol's Ferry and headed north on the river. They rowed across the Mississippi River to Garabet Island. For reference, this island is located about 8 miles north of the Arch. There, abolitionists were waiting with another boat to take the 4 slaves to the Illinois shore. Once they reached the shore, Jeff departed from the group and went his own way. He did not want his slow walking to endanger the entire group. They traveled on land for more than 20 miles. Within 24 hours, 3 of the men, Henry, Pell, and Tim, and their guide, are captured just north of Alton. Their captors, William Bowman and his brother, led them to the Jerseyville jail. At this point, their captors head south to St. Louis to alert the slave owners and claim their rewards. Being captured did not necessarily mean enslavement. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that we spoke of earlier was weakly enforced. When deciding freedom status, the courts gave freedom seekers the benefit of the doubt. A group of local abolitionists obtained a writ of habeas corpus and demanded a hearing. Habeas corpus is Latin for have the body. Literally, it's used to determine if detention of a prisoner is valid. It's used to bring a prisoner before court to determine if their imprisonment is lawful. The writ demands that a public officer deliver an imprisoned person to court and showed valid reason for their detention. It also allows a means to dispute legal bias of confinement. So, in this case, the writ is granted and made deliverable to the Illinois State Circuit Court, 70 miles north in Beardstown. Henry, Pell, Tim, and Williams are released into the custody of Murray Cheney, the deputy sheriff of Jerseyville. 2 of the abolitionists joined the group, Baptist minister Elijah Palmer and a local farmer named Isaac Snedeker. The group head north in Snedeker's wagon. By 10 p.m., they make it to Carrollton. The wagon is seized by the town's postmaster, Silloway. He leads the group to the town jail. So once again, Williams, Henry, Pell, and Tim spend the night in jail. In the morning, they are set free to continue their journey to Beardstown. By now, a group of Missouri slaveholders have caught up to our freedom seekers and their entourage. Though not capturing anyone, they do take over the group to ensure they make it to trial. The slaveholders didn't capture the men because doing so at this point might be considered kidnapping or a forcible rescue attempt, since the freedom status of the men had yet to be determined by the courts. What I'm assuming is a very awkward 55 miles later, the entire group arrives at Beardstown. They were granted an immediate hearing before Judge David Woodson. Elijah Palmer had hired 2 lawyers to represent the freedom seekers, David Smith and Michael McConnell. They argued that the men were being held illegally. The slaveholders hired 2 lawyers of their own, Henry Dummer and Thomas Brown. After a much heated debate, Judge Woodson declared that the men were being illegally held and released Williams, Henry, Tim, and Pell. The judge's order only stated that the initial arrest was illegal. It did not declare their freedom status. After exiting the courtroom, the slaveholders captured the men as fugitive slaves. Williams was included in the capture for assisting them. This action was verified as permissible by a local justice of the peace, and they returned to St. Louis. Once in St. Louis, Williams was thrown into jail to await trial. He confessed to enticing Tim, Jeff, Pell, and Henry to escape from slavery. There was talk in the newspaper about sending him to the state penitentiary, but records aren't quite clear what his actual fate was. The fate of the freedom seekers is mostly unknown. Nothing more was heard of Jeff after he departed the group. Pell remained enslaved to Glaspie until Glaspie's death, and at that time he was sold to John McCoon, Henry's owner. So this concludes our 3-part episode on 1849 in St. Louis. Not the best year for our city, with a cholera outbreak, a fire destroying a large percentage of buildings, a bank robbery, a race riot, and an unfortunately fated attempt at freedom. Thank you for joining me today. You can find me at our website at showmehistorystl.com, at Twitter at showme_history, and our Facebook page of Show Me History STL. Until next time, I'll see you in the loop.